Brothers and sisters, today is the great feast of St. Bartholomew. I'm just here at St. Peter's. If we look up at the top, we see on the top of St. Peter's those 12 apostles, according to the second reading in the office of reading of today to St. John Chrysostom, calls them the 12 uneducated men. And there they are with Christ in the middle there. And, you know, this amazing truth that these men with the power of divine grace, according to St. John Chrysostom, transformed and changed the entire world. We think of someone like St. Mary Magdalene as well, who had such a huge influence in the south of France, along with St. Martha and St. Lazarus, the house of Bethany that escaped there, you know, escaping persecution. Many years ago when I believe it was Pope Benedict was being appointed Pope, there was a cardinal from America on the balcony, and he was looking out into the distance, and the media caught his appearance and realized that he was sort of lost in thought, and they asked him, you know, your Grace, what were you thinking about at that moment? Why were you looking off into the distance? Well, everybody was sort of looking at the Pope just newly announced, and he said that, you know, here I am on the loggia of St. Peter, so the central window there where the Pope is announced to the world. And he says, you know, I'm looking down upon Rome, I'm looking down upon St. Peter's Square, and I'm thinking about the Roman Empire that used to persecute all these Christians, the same Roman Empire that put Peter to death, and Paul to death, and Andrew to death, and James to death, and all the apostles, and so many early Christians to death for hundreds of years, the first 300 years or so. And he says, you know, where's the Roman Empire today? And he says, you know, where's the successor to Nero or Trajan? But here I am on the lodge of St. Peter with the successor of a fisherman, St. Peter. And all these 2,000 years later, here we are. We're with the successor of St. Peter. And so these men have gone out and transformed the world to show the power of grace, to show that the power of divine help with them throughout these centuries, proclaiming the truth, proclaiming the gospel. And so, brothers and sisters, it's just amazing, because in this reflection for the reading today of St. Bartholomew, St. John Chrysostom says, you know, these men we see in the gospel were scared, they were afraid, they ran. Most of them left Christ, except St. John at the foot of the cross. What happened? And he said, what happened was the resurrection, that they saw Jesus rise from dead, and the risen Christ spoke courage into their hearts and was able to send them out to the whole world. He says, what gave these early Christians the courage to give up their lives for the faith, to leave Jerusalem, to go right into the heart of trouble, into Rome, into the heart of the Roman Empire that so desperately wanted to crush them? What was it that they saw with their eyes? What is it that they experienced if it wasn't for the resurrection and the power of the Holy Spirit that descended upon them at Pentecost? And so this is what we celebrate today on this great feast of the Apostle Bartholomew, who was so brutally murdered as well, along with the other apostles and all these other Christians, until Constantine would give the Edict of Toleration in the 4th century, which would allow freedom of religion for the Roman Empire. And then, so at that point, so many had become Christian and were hiding underground, were celebrating Mass in the catacombs, and at that point, they were able to celebrate their faith freely. And the virtue, the attraction of the Christians, we see an early letter by Diognetus in the very early centuries of the church. And he says the early Christians were so attractive to the pagans, attractive to other people, because they did not abort their children. They didn't leave their children out on rocks to die, you know, which was an early practice of the Romans. It was a form of infanticide. They didn't do that. They also stuck to one spouse for all their life. They shared their things in common. They loved. They made sacrifices. They were honest. They were courageous. They were faithful. They were all the fruits of the Holy Spirit we see in the gospel. And so this was hugely attractive to a decadent society at the time that was falling apart. The Roman Empire is falling apart with its pride and lust and greed and betrayal and emptiness. Power corrupts. And so throughout the church, we do fight with this within ourselves. Members of the church struggle with this internal turmoil, especially when we're not faithful to God, faithful to His grace. Then we fall into these ways of fallen humanity. But the saints always remind us, and all those Christians that you and I know, and that I know in this group, are witnesses of the grace of God, what the grace of God could do to the human heart, how we can make the human heart docile, how we can make the human heart love, how we can make the human heart become truly human. And so this is the power of grace, this is the power of the Holy Spirit, this is the power of the church, and this is what the church has to offer on the earth. Church has to offer the best version of humanity, because the best version of humanity is transformed in grace by the power of the Holy Spirit, through the sacraments, through baptism. And so what will happen when, we abandon the faith? What will happen when we will abandon the sacraments? Well, it's happening. We see people falling into despair. We see people falling into anxiety. We see people, just the world collapsing around us in many ways, because as a society we're moving far away from the gospel, and we are seeing the traits of the old Roman Empire and temptations reappearing.